I had a call from AMD UK the other day. They said we'd like to send you an example of a laptop with our brand new Ryzen 9 7945HX processor. Naturally I said great, sounds good. They said sadly this laptop comes with RTX 4090 laptop graphics rather than AMD graphics. I said well, okie dokie, that's no problem for me. And then they said, thing is we've noticed you've had, shall we say, issues with Asus in the recent past. I said, yes, we've made this public. What's the issue? They said, well, the laptop in question is an Asus. To be specific, a ROG Strix Scar 17 2023. And I replied, Kit Guru has no issue looking at Asus products. We just have some concerns with how Asus UK posted publicly and the wording they used, which goes against everything we believe in. And that's why we have a combination of an Asus laptop and an AMD CPU review. AMD is talking a big game about their new Ryzen 7045HX series of processors. Top of the heap, we have the 7945HX in this Asus ROG Strix Scar 17 laptop. Zen 4 technology, fabricated on TSMC's 5nm process, up to 16 cores and 32 threads, which is what we have in this particular processor, maximum boost 5.4 GHz, huge amounts of L2 and L3 cache, and 55 watts plus TDP. The plus is a bit peculiar, but that power rating is rather low. So let's see what that looks like in action with Cinebench 23. So many cores and threads, it looks like a desktop processor in action, and the final score is over 20,000, which is pretty bloomin' impressive. But did you notice the mains power was not connected? That was running on battery. So let's do that again. Running on mains power, the score is now north of 31,000. Those figures suggest these AMD Zen 4 Dragon Range HX processors have enormous potential, and we'll dig into performance later in this video. The Asus ROG Strix Scar 17 laptop gets its name from the screen, which is 17 inches on the diagonal with a resolution of 2560 by 1440 or Quad HD. It has a 240Hz refresh and uses IPS technology and supports G-Sync. The CPU is an AMD Ryzen 9 7945X, 16 cores, 32 threads, with an integrated AMD 610M GPU. The add-in graphics are NVIDIA GeForce RTX 4090 laptop with 16GB of GDDR6 memory that can run at just over 2 GHz on 175 watts of power. It's a large laptop measuring 395mm by 282, and the thickness is between 59mm and 72mm. The weight is 3 kilos for the laptop plus an extra 1 kilo for the 330 watt power adapter, and you need a mains cable on top of that. Ports and connectors, there's nothing on the right hand side or the front. On the left hand side we have two USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A's and a 3.5mm combo audio jack. On the rear we have a USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type C with both DisplayPort and power delivery, and another USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type C that does DisplayPort but does not do power delivery. We also have HDMI 2.1 and Realtek 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. Removing the bottom cover to get inside the laptop is quite straightforward. We remove 10 small screws, the 11th remains in place, and then we can lift off the bottom cover, which is tethered by two small ribbon cables. And here we have the vapor chamber cooler on both the CPU and the GPU. Perhaps the saddest thing about the vapor chamber cooler inside this laptop is that most owners will never get to see it, because of course it's hidden by the bottom cover. I've said in previous reviews I think there should be a window in the bottom cover so you get the full bling effect, but no, hidden away is what it is. And now we can take a good look at the hardware inside the laptop. The memory is 32GB of Samsung DDR5 4800 in dual channel. The storage, according to the Asus webpage, is a 2TB M.2 Gen 4 SSD. However, the SK Hynix PC801 in our laptop was a 1TB. Wi-Fi is by MediaTek and supports Wi-Fi 6E. The battery is a 90 watt-hour unit. We've established that under the custom vapor chamber cooler lie the AMD CPU and the NVIDIA GPU, and you might be hoping I'm going to remove the vapor chamber. However, I'm not. And the reason is that Asus has used Thermal Grizzly liquid metal thermal compound, and I don't much fancy risking getting some of that in the wrong place, either when I remove the cooler or reapplying liquid metal and reinstalling the cooler. So I'm leaving it well alone. AMD tells us they've put a good amount of work into developing the Zen 4 technology to work in mobile form, so this Ryzen 9 7945HX is not just a slower version of the desktop Ryzen 9 7950X. But when we look at power optimizations, we can see there's some clever stuff going on. The explanation is quite straightforward. Mobile processors work in different power states to desktop, which more or less are on or off or really go for it. In mobile, you're doing an awful lot of things behind the scenes with parts of the system shut down to save the all-important battery. And part of the tweaking means that core voltage has been lowered. AMD is adamant this is not simply a matter of binning chips and using more efficient chips in laptop form. They've done work that simply wasn't required on the desktop. As we know, on the desktop, 1.35 heading towards 1.4 is a fairly typical setting. In this mobile form, we're expecting to see 1.2 to 1.3 volts. That saves voltage, which in turn saves power, helps temperature, and also helps battery life. We have some comparison charts from AMD comparing the 7945HX with Intel's Core i9-13950HX, and AMD's claiming the win, both in terms of absolute performance and also performance per watt. We do not have figures from AMD comparing the 7945HX to their own desktop 7950X, but happily we've done some of that comparison work ourselves. It's all well and good AMD working on the efficiency of their processor, but when you move on to the laptop, in this case an Asus, you have a cooling system that covers both the CPU and the GPU, and you have a combined power budget which covers both the CPU and the GPU. And in this particular instance, the GPU is taking best part of double the power of the CPU. It's a bit of a power hog, is that RTX 4090 laptop. Now, I'm not saying the CPU is being left to its own devices, that isn't true, but it is definitely, in terms of power and cooling, the junior partner in the equation, as we can see when we look at Asus's Armory Crate software. When we look in Armory Crate, we can see a number of profiles: performance, silent, turbo, and manual. Manual gives the game away. It allows us to set the boost power and sustained power limits for our processor. And here we can see that that 55 watt plus processor is actually being fed essentially infinite power. We're up to the 120-125 watt mark. And when we look to the right hand side of Armory Crate, we can see GPU mode. We have a few things on offer. So we have standard mode, and we mouse over and it tells us what is going on. Standard, good performance. Eco mode, those very expensive RTX 4090 graphics are disabled. Optimized looks after the switch over from IGP to GPU. And Ultimate gives it a bit of extra power and a few extra megahertz. We're going to test the Ryzen 9 7945HX in two power states. The first is default turboing to 125 watts, then pulling back to 120. In essence, infinite power, and then a nominal figure I've chosen, which is 65 watts. The TDP given by AMD is 55 watts plus, and we understand the range they expect manufacturers to use is 55 to 75, which is clearly a long way away from 120, 125. So 65 sits in the middle of that range. Clearly it is restricted relative to this infinite figure. So let's kick off Cinebench 23 with 125 watts boost. Initial boost 4.7 GHz all cores, and the laptop is lovely and quiet. The temperature has clearly shot up to its thermal limit, clock speed is high, power draw still high, cooling system surprisingly quiet. And now we see the CPU power draw dropping whilst the cooling system ramps up significantly. In this relatively short test, the CPU clock speed is being maintained pretty much at the boost limit, and the cooling system is now clearly working flat out. And now let's take a look at the GPU performance, that RTX 4090 laptop graphics chip, and what it does in the TimeSpy stress test. The board powers 150 watts and clock speed is north of 2 GHz. The cooling system, loud. So I think you get a decent idea on default of what a gaming experience might be like on this laptop. We set the power limits manually to 65 watts and then we run Cinebench 23 once again. Boost speed is 3.9 GHz on all cores. The temperature is icy cool. The cooling system completely quiet. It's worth reminding ourselves this is a laptop CPU, 16 cores. Yes, it's operating just under 4 GHz, but it's sipping power and is storming along. In TimeSpy stress test, the graphics are still pulling north of 150 watts. They're actually past 160 watts. The GPU performance is epic, but the reduction in CPU power draw has definitely had an impact on the cooling system as a whole. Our takeaway here is that AMD is quite correct to say a power range of 55 to 75 watts makes a lot of sense. In this instance, 65. If you run the system close to 100 watts for the CPU and you add on 150 watts plus for the GPU, the cooling system has to work bloomin' hard. Let's take a look at our performance charts and see how those CPU behaviors translate into performance. Cinebench R23 multi-core. Wow! At the top of the chart by a significant distance we have the new Ryzen 9. At 92 watts actual power, the processor is running at about 4.3 GHz. Slow it to 65 watts. Curiously, it actually pulls 66 watts. The clock speed 3.7 GHz. Just for fun, we've added in a bunch of desktop processors to see where this mobile processor sits in the overall scheme of things. Interesting to note, the Ryzen 9 7945X is close behind the Ryzen 9 7950X 3D desktop processor, and that despite the fact it is significantly slower on clock speed and drawing a lot less power. In fairness, the full-on desktop Ryzen 9 7950X, which is running north of 5 GHz and pulling over 200 watts, isn't really that far ahead. These mobile HX processors are truly impressive. Cinebench R23 single core, also dominated by the new Ryzen 9 7945HX. Blender 3.1 Classroom, just look at the new AMD processor storming ahead. Admittedly, we're comparing here to 12th gen Intel rather than the 13th gen, but we're fairly clear that the story isn't going to change a great deal even with the latest and greatest from Intel. CPU power consumption. These new HX processors draw a reasonable amount of power. They are relatively thirsty. But when we mix in desktop processors, we see there really isn't a lot of comparison. Whilst they're relatively juicy as laptop processors go, compared to desktop processors, this looks like the way of the future. Small form factor PCs using mobile parts. Bapco Crossmark, a test that up to now we would have said favoured Intel, and here we have the Ryzen 9 7945HX at the top of the chart. 7-zip version 22. Good lord, just look at AMD go. ADA 64 memory bandwidth. The new Ryzen 9 7945HX is paired with DDR5 4800. It's interesting to look at the Asus ROG Zephyrus G14 at the bottom of the chart with previous gen AMD hardware, where the difference between read and write speeds is huge. In the past, it was fair to say AMD memory control might not have been the greatest. When you look at the new Ryzen 9 7945HX with DDR5, you're hard pressed to say it's AMD rather than Intel. There's still a gap in favour of Intel, however AMD is catching up at quite a pace. 3D Mark CPU profile. The new AMD at the top of the chart regardless of the power setting. 3D Mark TimeSpy, just the CPU test, and here we can see that power plays its part. The Core i7 12700H on 107 watts, beating out the Ryzen 9 7945HX at 92 watts. But there's very little in it. And then we have some gaming benchmarks at 1080p. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy is a bit of a mixed bag. At the top of the chart we have the MSI Raider GE76. That's a Core i9-12900HK with RTX 3080 Ti graphics, and it beats this new ROG Strix Scar 17 by 10 FPS. However, look at the 1% lows. This new laptop is absolutely storming along. It's curious to see it's not just at the top of the chart in outright terms, but it is doing very well. Far Cry 6 at 1080p. This is what we expected to see. The ROG Strix Scar 17 at the top of the chart, the combination of Ryzen 9 7945HX and RTX 4090 laptop doing excellently. And in Watch Dogs Legion at 1080p, the new Asus laptop is streets ahead. 113 FPS against 86 for the MSI Raider GE76. In our battery rundown test, the ROG Strix Scar scored 241 minutes, or 4 hours and a minute. You can effectively double that time in the real world. The question is, could you actually bear to carry a 3 kilo laptop around for 8 hours? I suspect not. You may have wondered why I showed gaming results at 1080p when this has a Quad HD 1440 display. I have tested at 1440. The thing is, KitGuru gets sent some slightly bizarre laptop examples, really beefy laptops with 1080p displays, so most of my comparison data is 1080p. Switching to 1440p from 1080p, the FPS change is absolutely minuscule, between 5 and 10 FPS. This laptop can absolutely game at 1440p without any difficulty whatsoever. As if you thought there could possibly be any chance that RTX 4090 laptop graphics wouldn't be able to do 1440p. Of course they can. On the subject of those graphics, this laptop costs £3,700 here in the UK approximately. There's a version of this laptop that has RTX 4080 laptop graphics, and it's like £3,100. You're paying like a £600 premium for the 4090, and as we know, the NVIDIA laptop graphics are severely cut down from the true desktop parts. That strikes me as being a huge amount of extra money to pay for the 4090 over the 4080. Before I come to my final thoughts on the processor and the laptop, a few other bits and pieces to do with this Asus ROG Strix Scar 17 2023. Keyboard, perfectly okay. Touchpad, large, perfectly okay. Layout of the keyboard, okay. Screen, I like. One thing that impressed me is that the keyboard just does not get hot to the touch. Sometimes these hefty laptops, they basically radiate heat directly upwards. Whether there's some sort of heat shielding inside the laptop that I simply didn't see, I don't know. But the fact is, the heat does not come up. You can use this laptop as a laptop, provided you can bear the weight. I did notice that these vents below the screen, depending on the exact angle of the screen, you get a certain amount of airflow kind of coming up the screen and towards you. But if you put the screen further back, not an issue. To conclude, pros, the good points. Stunning CPU performance. These new Dragon Range processors, impressive. The Asus Vapor Chamber Cooler, really good. This has been true for a few generations. This hardware, excellent. NVIDIA RTX 40 series laptop graphics are very good. The 4090 is clearly king of the heap. Yup, it storms along, although you pay for the privilege. And to my great surprise, this laptop has decent battery life, and to my even greater surprise, the processor works really well on battery. Cons, the negatives. A 3 kilo laptop with a 1 kilo power brick and a power cord, it's unwieldy. I just don't like it. And inherent to this HX series of processors, rather than thin and light processors, lower power models, these processors are inevitably going to end up in laptops like this, because it only makes sense to ally a high power processor with high power graphics. And if you're using 230 watt or 330 watt power adapters, you have to have a chassis and cooling that can handle it. So it's going to be big. Asus Armory crate, slightly frustrating. Then again, any control utility seems to be quite frustrating. As I've already mentioned, you pay a fortune for each bump in NVIDIA graphics. They're doing very well. They currently rule the market in graphics, and they make us pay for the privilege. And finally, the layout of the ports and connectors of this specific laptop is slightly weird. No ports on the one side, a few ports on the other. Means you can't connect a mouse to either one side or the other. Presumably you go wireless instead. And a fair few of the ports are on the back. Certainly all the good ones are. and I find that a bit odd. After all, the chassis is huge, there's plenty of space for connectors. If I was scoring the laptop, and I'm not, I'd probably give it 8 out of 10 and worth buying. But instead, we're reviewing the processor here, so I'm scoring the processor, the Ryzen 9 7945HX, scoring that at 8.5 out of 10 and a worth buying.